back to Pokemon episode summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 412, Numero Uno Articuno. The episode begins with Ash and the gang having left Misty on their way to the Battle Factory. Max was trying his best to direct Ash and the gang to the Battle Factory by using his Pokénav, but by the time it reached sunset, Ash and the gang still hadn't arrived, making Max frustrated, thinking something was fucking wrong with his Pokénav or some shit. Brock, seeing that none of them knew where they are, tried to look at a map of the Kanto region he had in his backpack, but even then, he couldn't find out exactly where they were, and suggested that they must have gotten lost or taken a wrong turn. But Max, not wanting to have been mistaken with his Pokénav, assured Brock that they had to have been close to the Battle Factory. They were almost there. Brock still wasn't sure, but Ash got motivated by Max's determination, and the gang continued to look for the Battle Factory, but several hours later, much to Ash and the gang's dismay, they still hadn't arrived at the Battle Factory, and the full moon was visible above the trees now. It was late at night. Ash was very hyped to get to the Battle Factory, but now he was just depressed at the fact that Max's instructions had led them astray. Max now couldn't defend himself and felt the need to apologize, so he did. Ash was still depressed as fuck, but he was also tired as fuck, so Brock suggested that they make a spot to camp out for the night, and although Ash really wanted to get to the battle as soon as possible, he was like, you know what, yeah, I'm tired, let's make a spot to camp. This was tiring work in and of itself, though, setting up a tent and all that. And a few minutes after working to set up camp, they decided to take a little break to admire the beautiful moon. Per May's suggestion, because she hoped that all them looking at the moon could help give them motivation and relax them a little bit. Right as Ash and the gang started pointing at the moon, trying to pinpoint exactly what was on its surface for some reason, likely just because they were bored, a little bit of snow then blew by them. Shocking Ash and Pikachu first, since they were the first ones to feel it, and then shocking May and Max and Brock after that. They were all especially shocked because it was a warm night, so there shouldn't have been any snow whatsoever. Suddenly, Ash and the gang all spot something in the distance, flying overhead. They had to look at it for a while, and they had to get closer, but after a few seconds, Ash and the gang could finally see it clear enough to identify it as none other than the legendary Pokemon, Articuno. Ash and the gang were obviously very hyped to see a legendary Pokemon, and May was so hyped that she almost couldn't hold her Pokedex when she scanned it to learn a little bit more about it, although there wasn't much, since it was a legendary Pokemon. Ash and the gang were even more amazed as Articuno got even closer to them, but it soon flew back in the air, and was soon joined by a small plane, which flew next to Articuno, as Articuno had no reservations against this plane. It seemed to be comfortable with it. Just then, though, Ash and the gang noticed that the plane was starting to malfunction, and the engine was starting to rattle. Eventually, the engine emits a lot of smoke, which covers Ash and the gang down on the ground, making them dirty, and also blinding them for a bit. When they managed to get all the smoke and exhaust off their faces, though, much to their shock, the plane and Articuno were gone, so Ash and the gang started to stress that maybe the plane crashed, and Articuno went down to rescue it. Meanwhile, we then see Team Rocket, who had been trailing Ash and the gang as usual, and they'd also decided to set up camp. They had been covered in smoke as well, because the smoke had went that far. It's not like they were that far of a distance away from Ash and the gang, though. They were just eating the little bit of food they had left, their bedtime snack, when they happened to see Articuno in the sky, along with the plane, but they didn't care about that shit. They only cared about the Articuno, since it was a legendary Pokemon. Team Rocket's initial plan that they were thinking of was to go to the battle factory that Ash was heading to and steal all the Pokemon in there, assuming that there had to have been a lot of Pokemon in there if Ash was going to battle there. But upon seeing Articuno, Meowth was the one who first advocated trying to capture Articuno for Giovanni. And Meowth proceeded to have a boss fantasy of what Giovanni would use Articuno for, imagining Giovanni getting out of bed in his underwear and opening up the curtains to see the sun reflecting in, realizing that it was a hot morning. He would turn on his fan and wave his fan, but it would be so hot that his electric fan would short circuit, and he would be flapping his paper fan so hard that it would break. Luckily, though, right as Giovanni was about to pass out, Articuno would come in and use an ice attack to cool Giovanni down. Basically, Meowth stated that Articuno could cool Giovanni down on hot days. This made Jesse and James excited, wanting to capture Articuno a lot, although they admitted that the fantasy was weirdly perverted and odd. But even after they all cheered, including Wobbuffet wanting to get the Articuno, James suddenly realized that catching Articuno would be a bad idea, remembering that Articuno was an extremely powerful legendary Pokemon, and he didn't think that Team Rocket had the capabilities to capture something that strong, and asked Jesse and Meowth if they really thought they could capture something as strong as Articuno, and Jesse and Meowth begrudgingly admitted that they didn't. Wobbuffet then popped out his Pokeball to agree that no, Team Rocket stood no chance against Articuno. James then realized that if they could actually think of a plan, then maybe they would have a chance against Articuno, but he quickly realized he was just in denial. None of Team Rocket's plans had ever worked. And just to make sure he wasn't forgetting about a plan that did work, James asked Meowth and Jesse if there was a plan that had worked, but they confirmed that none of their plans had worked. James, however, then actually came up with an idea, declaring that they could use this idea to capture not only Articuno, but also all the Pokemon from the Battle Factory and Pikachu when Ash arrived, stating that they should just simply steal Pikachu and the Pokemon of the Battle Factory and Articuno. No fancy plans, just classic stealing. And Jesse and Meowth were more than happy to try something different, and something that required less effort. So with that, Team Rocket developed flames in their eyes to show their fiery passion, ready to implement their new non-plan to steal the Pokemon. Meanwhile, back with Ash and the gang, they had decided not to camp out, and were instead looking around the forest area, very excited to try and find Articuno. However, after a while of searching, they didn't come across an Articuno, much to their dissatisfaction, but they cheered themselves up a little bit because at least they showed up at a Pokemon Center, managing to find one in the middle of nowhere. Even if going into the Pokemon Center wouldn't lead them to Articuno, Ash still wanted to go in, hoping that Nurse Joy would know where the battle factory was and could give directions. So Ash and the gang went in, and Brock instantly flirted with Nurse Joy, as usual, only to be pulled away by the ear by Max. However, Brock was fucking insane this episode. He just didn't give up with flirting with Nurse Joy. Like, there's fucking, like, 2 fucking minutes of just Nurse Joy flirting. It's insane. But it ends the same way, with Nurse Joy being embarrassed, and Brock getting pulled away by Max, again, by the ear. This allowed Ash and May to talk to Nurse Joy, both of them asking Nurse Joy if she knew where the battle factory was. But Nurse Joy told them that she would tell them the location of the battle factory in the morning. She didn't know where it was, but first, she saw how tired Ash and the gang looked, and she wanted them to get some sleep, and invited them to stay in the Pokemon Center's guest rooms. Ash and the gang realized how tired they were, and eagerly took up the offer, falling asleep. And the next morning, Ash and the gang were rested up and ready to resume their journey to the battle factory, and Nurse Joy came out to say goodbye to them, and was finally about to reveal the directions to the battle factory, when suddenly she was stopped, as a voice was heard, telling Nurse Joy not to bother with the directions. Ash and the gang and Nurse Joy then turned around to see none other than Scott, the guy from the last episode of the Hoenn saga, that was basically allegedly related to the Battle Frontier in some way. The reason why he told Nurse Joy to stop explaining the directions was because he thought there was no point, because he was just offering to take Ash and the gang to the battle factory in his nice little red car. Before they went, though, Brock, May, and Max questioned who the fuck Scott was, because they had never met him before, leading to Scott introduce himself to them, and Ash greeted him, explaining more about Scott. So May, Max, and Brock all introduced themselves to Scott as well, and Scott took Ash and the gang in his car to the battle factory, speeding there extremely wildly, with Brock commenting that Scott appeared to drive as wild as Professor Birch. And he even took a weird shortcut that was a dangerous pathway, but at least they had made it to the battle factory. Scott had kept his promise. Scott was a little embarrassed, but also exhilarated by how fast he was going, and also by the cool shortcut he took through the woods. Ash and the gang were very dizzy from the terrible driving, but at the end of the day, they were just glad to have survived. And now they were at the battle factory, so they soon got out of the car and arrived at the battle factory gates, about to go in, when suddenly they heard something rattling, which they identified as the sound of an engine. The sound of this engine was revealed to be coming through a very large vehicle, which smashed through the doors of the factory and nearly ran Ash and the gang over. Though Ash and the gang just barely managed to dodge, along with Scott, as dust from the impact of the destroyed doors filled the area. Ash and the gang then hear someone talking from inside the vehicle, exclaiming that the vehicle was out of control, so Ash, May, and Brock knew they had to stop it, sending out their Pokemon to do so. Especially motivated, since Ash and the gang and Scott realized that the machine was heading straight for them again, and they didn't want to panic about it, so Ash sent out his Grovyle, Brock sent out his Mudkip, and May sent out a Combuskin. Combuskin used Fire Spin, Grovyle used Bullet Seed, and Mudkip used Water Gun, and these attacks were enough to stop the machine in its tracks. And they just sat there, emitting smoke due to the damage, when suddenly a hatch opened on top of the machine, and a man climbed out, complaining about how the machine didn't listen to a thing that he said. Basically confirming that he had viewed his machine as almost sentient. The man then thanks Ash and the gang for their help with stopping his malfunctioning machine, and Scott addresses him as Noland, and asks him to introduce himself to the gang, as if he was important or something. Instead, however, Noland introduced his vehicle as the Noland J9, his latest and greatest super machine, saying that it was his finest creation, even if it was malfunctioning. And it was powered by steam. Noland was going to go on and on about his vehicle, which confused May and Max as to why Noland was introducing his vehicle, but not himself. But Noland's talking was interrupted by his assistant, named Sergio. And he runs to Noland, panically asking if he was playing with his goddamn machine again, having heard it. Leading Noland to scold his assistant, clarifying that he wasn't playing, he was doing a hobby. Scott asked what the difference between playing and a hobby was, and Noland couldn't answer. Alright then, dude. Because he couldn't answer, Noland felt a bit awkward, and decided to formally introduce his assistant as Sergio, and added that Sergio was his #1 apprentice. Although Scott suggested that Noland should introduce himself, and Noland finally does, introducing himself as Noland, the factory head. Ash was confused as to what the fuck this meant, so Scott explained to Ash that him being a factory head meant that he was the frontier brain of the battle factory, aka the person that Ash needed to face. Leading Ash to introduce himself and immediately ask for a battle with Noland, explaining that he wanted a battle immediately because he was participating in the battle frontier, and Noland accepts. Meanwhile, as for Team Rocket, they were spying on Ash and the gang and Noland, and Sergio and Scott from a nearby tree with binoculars. They had overheard that Noland had made plenty of machines that had failed, so they figured that he must have had plenty of spare parts, so they updated the plan, which they all cheered for, along with Boba Fett. Not only were they going to steal Battle Factory Pokemon, but they were also going to steal some spare machine parts to build their own mechs. Meanwhile, before Ash and Noland could have their battle, Noland had to make sure all the Pokemon he could use from the battle factory were at full health and ready to battle. So he had his assistant Sergio feed them some Pokeblocks to charge them up. So Sergio called all the Pokemon out, exclaiming that it was Pokeblock time, and a Venusaur, Sandslash, Golduck, Machamp, Rhydon, Rhyhorn, Pinsir, Breloom, Lairon, Manectric, Camerupt, and Trapinch all came running out, and immediately started chowing down on the Pokeblocks that Sergio had put out. May, Max, and Brock were very shocked, along with Ash, to see all these Pokemon eating Pokeblocks at the same time, but they were even more shocked when May's Munchlax forcibly popped up its Pokeball, seeing that everyone was eating Pokeblocks. It obviously wanted Pokeblocks too. May panicked, thinking that Munchlax being out was a bad thing, so she tried to call it back into his Pokeball, but Sergio stops her, saying that there was plenty of Pokeblock for more Pokemon to eat than just the Pokemon at the battle factory, so they could afford to feed Munchlax, so May thanked Sergio. Ash stated his surprise by the large number of different Pokemon and asked Nolan if they were all really his, and Nolan confirms this, saying that he had all these different types of Pokemon because, unlike a gym leader who only specified on one type, Nolan could potentially battle with basically every type. Nolan informs Ash that there was also something different about this upcoming battle between the two of them that was different from a gym battle, being that Ash could choose as many of these Pokemon to fight as he wanted, and he could choose which one to fight. So he could only fight one Pokemon, he could fight basically every single one of them, it was all up to him. Ash had very much not considered choosing a Pokemon to fight, and when Nolan asked him to decide, he couldn't. He was him and hawing between Venusaur, the final form of Bulbasaur, since he had a Bulbasaur, so he figured he would know how Venusaur worked, or he wanted to battle Rhyhorn for a test of his own power. He wanted to battle Machamp to see if he could tackle strong fighting moves, to see if he could still potentially beat Brawly back in Hoenn. He couldn't decide. Anyways, back with Munchlax, it was eating some Pokeblocks next to a Rhyhorn and a Sandslash when it suddenly grabbed one of the bowls of Pokeblocks and ran off into a nearby building, one that was connected to the battle factory. May and Max saw it going off, so they quickly chased after it and ended up in the building with it. But we then cut to Team Rocket again, who was watching Ash and the gang and Nolan and all the Pokemon from atop of a building now. And Meowth suggested that they should steal every single one of Nolan's Battle Factory Pokemon, noting how strong they all seemed. And James, however, had his doubts that they would actually be able to steal so many Pokemon, stating that usually when they got too greedy, they ended up getting fucked over in the end. But Meowth rebutted that they usually ended up getting fucked over all the time, and assured James that he knew what he was doing now. And even though James was opposed to plans now, Meowth assured James that this plan he had come up with would work. Meanwhile, back with May and Max, they gave chase to Munchlax and entered the building Munchlax went into. Since it was so dark inside the room, they had to search and call out for Munchlax for a decent amount of time, but it didn't take that long for them to actually find Munchlax alone, standing on a crate, eating Pokeblocks all by itself. Likely wanting to eat in private, because he didn't want to worry about any of the other Pokemon stealing his food. Well, that's ironic coming from a food stealer, but anyways, Max's attention then goes to something else. Despite it being dark, he was able to see an airplane, which he recognized as the airplane they saw flying in the sky next to Articuno last night. Just then, a cold breeze starts blowing. And it's almost like snow, like last night, but it was coming from behind Munchlax, so May came to the conclusion that Munchlax was producing the ice and could have learned an ice move, such as Blizzard or Icy Wind, but Max knew what those moves looked like really well, and clarified that it wasn't Blizzard or Icy Wind. A few seconds later, the truth was unveiled, when suddenly Articuno rose up from behind Munchlax and then went out of the building through the door, leaving Max and May obviously surprised to see this Articuno. Obviously, since Articuno flew outside, Scott, Sergio, Nolan, Ash, and Brock all saw it, with Nolan remarking that it seemed as though he couldn't keep the Articuno a surprise any longer, and when May and Max showed up and explained the situation with Munchlax and Articuno, Nolan started to explain about the Articuno, admitting that he, in fact, flew yesterday with Articuno in his plane, confirming that the plane that Ash and the gang saw last night was the one that Max and May had saw in the building. May and Max were impressed that Nolan was able to fucking catch a legendary Articuno, assuming that it must have been his, but Nolan simply said that Articuno was his friend, but still a wild Pokemon. Ash and the gang were obviously very curious to hear Nolan and Articuno's story of how they met, so Nolan explains that one night he was test flying his plane when he first built it. The Articuno suddenly appeared flying next to him, which very much startled Nolan because he didn't expect a legendary Pokemon to be flying at the same altitude as his test plane. But Nolan was no longer scared of Articuno when he noticed that it was hurt since it was having trouble flying, which made Nolan realize that it had injured its wings during one of its flights from mountaintop to mountaintop, which is what Articuno was known for. Sure enough, Articuno was confirmed to be hurt when it started to fall down, so Nolan instantly flew down on his plane to help it, managing to get Articuno to fall on the roof of his plane. So then he brought Articuno down to the ground and helped it heal, and it healed soon after this. And since then, Articuno had become his friend, wanting to visit Nolan regularly. He didn't usually stay at Nolan's place often, but he did visit quite a bit. But he just wouldn't stay for an extended period of time. Max, after hearing Nolan's story with Articuno, wanted to see Articuno fly up in the sky, so requested if he could go up in Nolan's plane to get even with it in the sky, and Nolan agreed. Max also decided to take Pikachu with him so that Pikachu could see Articuno fly as well, and Ash allowed this, telling Pikachu to hop off his shoulder and go in Max's lap, and Pikachu did as soon as Max got in the plane, and they took off with Nolan in the driver's seat, obviously, because Max didn't know how to drive a plane. Eventually, Articuno and Nolan started competing to see who could fly the best, going up and down, up and down, up and down, much to Max and Pikachu's amazement, as they just got to experience the flight without even having to pilot the plane. They were having an absolute great time, especially when Nolan jolted up. However, when Nolan jolted down, Max and Pikachu started crying, both with joy and sadness at the same time, because of how rough it was going down. May, Brock, and Scott were watching from the ground, so excited by the plane flying with Articuno that they didn't even notice that Ash had disappeared until he actually came back. Brock asked where the fuck Ash had went, leading Ash to reveal that he just had to go and make a quick phone call, presumably having used a spare phone that was in Scott's car or some shit. Just then, Scott notices something else flying in the sky, and he alerts Brock, May, and Ash to this. It turns out that what they saw in the sky was none other than Team Rocket in a new mech that they had built from some spare parts in the area from Nolan's old destroyed machines, and they were very quickly landing near all of the Pokemon. Ash was curious as to what they were up to this time. They quickly did their motto, and they declared that they were going to steal all the Battle Factory's Pokemon. Just as they were about to, however, Ash ordered Pikachu to attack, but then he remembered that Pikachu was up in the plane with Max, so Pikachu couldn't use any attack. Nolan, Max, and Articuno observe Team Rocket from the air, and they see Ash go to send out his Grovyle, since he couldn't use Pikachu, but right before he could send out Grovyle, Meowth implemented his plan, using one of the new mech's many hands to grab Grovyle's Pokeball right out of Ash's hand, stealing Grovyle. And then the mech goes back up in the air and uses the extendable hands to grab about 50% of Nolan's Pokemon. The other 50% unfortunately ran away for Team Rocket, but Team Rocket was fine with half, and they went back into the air, about to fly off and escape, happy with having half of the Pokemon. May, Brock, and Ash panicked a little bit, wondering what the fuck they could do since Team Rocket was in the air and they had no way to get up into the air. But thankfully, Nolan then showed up in the plane and rammed Team Rocket's mech with his plane, which freed all the Pokemon as they all fell out of the hands and were thankfully uninjured. And also, the mech came crashing down onto the ground, causing some dust to fly up in the process, making Team Rocket angry, obviously. Nolan then states to Team Rocket that he sure did find their mech interesting and complimented their mech building abilities, which Meowth quickly takes full credit for because it was his plan. But Nolan wasn't that impressed with Team Rocket to let them get away with stealing his Pokemon, so he called Articuno down and asked Articuno to get rid of Team Rocket. Articuno obliged, flying down and grabbing the mech with its claws, lifting it off the ground, and it threw it high in the air, and then used an ice beam to send Team Rocket blasting off, also destroying their mech in the process, leading Ash and Gang and Scott to all comment on how fucking cool Articuno was and how strong it was. Later that night, Nolan and Max had flown down along with Articuno, with Nolan standing by Articuno, and Nolan quickly decided that they should have a victory dinner for defeating Team Rocket, so they had some nice dinner, as well as some orange juice, and all just stood around a table. As a topic of conversation, Nolan asked Ash if he had decided which Pokemon he wanted to battle against out of his at the Battle Factory, and Ash confirmed this. Max stated his assumption that Ash probably wanted to battle a Venusaur, and May thought that he wanted to battle a Rhyhorn, recalling that those were Ash's two main picks before, but Ash denies both Max and May, saying he actually wanted to go one-on-one against Articuno, which Pikachu affirmed while eating its Pokemon food. The gang was very shocked by this due to how strong Articuno was, although Nolan didn't seem that surprised, assuming that Ash would want to take on his strongest Pokemon. So Nolan just turned to Articuno and asked if it agreed to battle, and Articuno confirmed. So Nolan simply asked Ash what Pokemon he would be using, leading Ash to look up towards the moon and say that his Pokemon was arriving right now. Everyone didn't understand what Ash meant by this, so they looked up to the moon as well, and they saw something flying towards Ash, soon recognizing it as a Charizard, which Ash and Brock recognized as Ash's own Charizard. Yeah, that's right, Ash had decided to battle Nolan with his Charizard, having called it back from the Charizard Valley, revealing that the call he made earlier was actually to Liza at the Charizard Valley, where Charizard was training, so that he could use it. Charizard happily greets Ash with his usual flamethrower, which annoys Ash, but he also missed it, so he wasn't that pissed off. Nolan says that he was definitely looking forward to tomorrow to see if Articuno could overcome its type disadvantage against Charizard, confident that it could. Ash was a bit disappointed that he had to wait until tomorrow to battle, but he realized that would be for the best, because he could get reacquainted with Charizard before the battle began. The episode then ends with Ash and Nolan staring each other down, declaring to each other that they were going to be the ones to win the battle, and Articuno and Charizard eyed each other down as well.